We are recording the webinar. We are going to archive it and make it available on the HREA website. If you have any misgivings about having your image in the webinar, then do keep your camera off. Otherwise, I would warmly welcome you to put your camera on. I see some of you have already. We appreciate that because it does help to build community, and especially in the Q&A timing, it would be lovely to have your faces visible to us. So the format for our webinar is pretty straightforward. After this general introduction, Crystal, our HREA associate, is going to introduce our speakers, who are then going to present each of them for about 15 minutes. And then following that, we're going to have a Q&A session where you get an opportunity to ask questions. We do already have a place for you to be putting questions that maybe occur to you as the speakers are presenting. If you check in the chat box, you will find a link to the Jamboard. Hopefully you're familiar with how the Jamboard works. If you're not familiar with it, no worries. You're welcome to put your question in the chat box itself, and one of us will transfer it over to the Jamboard. So no worries at all. But we would appreciate you to put your question in writing, and we'll make sure that it's on the Jamboard, and speakers can then choose which ones time and interest to address. So again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Human Rights Education Associates, which is sponsoring this webinar, is an organization that's been around for about 25 years. It's worked internationally in promoting education and training to promote human rights and all the agendas of human rights, preventing human rights violations, and promoting on a positive culture of human rights in all the areas of life in which we live and work. So with that, let me turn over the floor to Crystal. And thank you so much, Crystal, for organizing this webinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tivitz, for the opening remarks. And I want to echo the warm welcome to our Earth Day webinar, and I'll go to the slides to give background information of this event. First of all, I'm greatly honored to introduce our two guest speakers in this intergenerational conversation, Professor Nicholas King and Amina Castronovo. Both of them are doing significant work in raising awareness of climate change and promoting the right to environment in different parts of the world. Today, by presenting their experience and thoughts on climate justice, our guest speakers will lead us to reflect on, sorry, please mute yourself. Thank you. Our guest speakers will lead us to reflect on what we have been doing around the Earth Day for the past few weeks and throughout the year. And also, we will look ahead to the hope for a sustainable future. So our first guest speaker is Professor Nicholas King. Professor King teaches postgraduate programs on sustainability at 4 universities in South Africa. He is an independent researcher and consultant with over 25 years experience in global environmental change. He is also an expert advisor to the Center for Environmental Rights in South Africa. His recent report, Climate Change Implications for South Africa's Youth, is part of a series launched by the center in support of the youth-led climate campaign in this country. His experience includes being a co-chair of the Science and Policy Advisory Board for the UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook from 2015 to 2019, and a member of the Science Advisory Board of the UN's Global Synthesis Report in 2021 under the title, Making Peace with Nature. Another special guest speaker is Amina Castronovo. Amina is an experienced youth climate activist. She's a senior at Beacon High School and a student government president at school. She has been playing a leadership role in organizing the New York City branch of the International Climate Strike with Fridays For Future NYC as their co-policy director. In addition, Amina is working towards a plastic-free school initiative and a climate story map with a project team at Teachers College, Columbia University. She's also a student leader of the Environmental Justice Club at school and also a green team mentor for various schools in New York City. So thank you both for coming. And Professor Nicholas King will be presenting first. Welcome, Professor King. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And I'm just going to share my screen. And if you can tell me if that's coming up. And can you see my first slide, the title slide?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so good morning to everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to HREA to present on this. What I'd like to talk to you about today is just why it's incredibly important for youth today to become involved in climate activism. It's an absolutely critical issue regarding intergenerational equity. So just to kick off, I'm going to ask how many of you have seen the movie Don't Look Up, the Netflix movie? And if you haven't, I really would recommend it, because it's just a fantastic parody of exactly what we'll talk about today and about what the climate crisis is. It's a scientifically proven existential crisis, in their case, the asteroid that's going to hit the Earth. And there's just this total denial and lack of adequate response by decision makers. And that's absolutely crucial point to make. So Crystal mentioned a little bit of my background to just say the information I'm talking about comes a lot from these global assessments, the 6th Global Environmental Outlook with UNEP I was involved in, the IPCC's reports, the IPBES global assessments. These were brought together into a synthesis report called Making Peace with Nature for the United Nations. And then my work locally in South Africa, where I was the lead author on this book. So it's to try and bring both the global and the local So just that opening slide, this is the work of Ed Dawkins at University, which shows how from the global average of the 20th century, here is the white. Anything that's blue was below that average. Anything that red was above that average. And this is for every country around the world. So you can see how those temperatures have been going up from the start of the 20th century right through to our present day, and where we're pretty much well over 1 degree above that average already everywhere around the world. And that rise in temperature, that global heating, is because of this energy that we're pumping into the atmosphere through greenhouse gases. The equivalent of 500,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs every day, 365 days a year, that's how much energy we are pumping into that atmosphere, and that's what's causing the global heating. And of course, just like any closed system where you pump more energy into it, I think just simply whenever you put the kettle on, it becomes more volatile. And so that global heating is leading to climate change. It's making the climate more volatile. And so we're seeing this increase in climate extremes worldwide. And if we just look back to 1980, there were about 200 of these storms, extreme temperatures, floods, and mudslides. And then these have sort of pretty much doubled up every decade since. So somebody alive today is going to experience at least 4 times as many extreme events as somebody alive in 1980. And those are the types of things we're talking about in terms of the intergenerational legacy that today's youth and future generations are going to be experiencing. And those extreme events, of course, are going to happen more frequently and become more extreme. So if we just look at a couple of examples, Australia's fires that we had a year or 2 back were basically beyond the capability of the disaster response teams to control. They were virtually unstoppable. It was record heat, and we had mass evacuations and destruction of property. In my own region in Southern Africa, in 2019, we had 2 tropical cyclones for the first time in 1 season. It virtually destroyed the city of Beira, displaced about 2 million people in Mozambique, our neighbor. And in 2022, we've already had 3 such storms in our region. And I'll talk a little bit about the KZN floods later. The IPCC's 6th assessment report, which came out towards the end of last year, and Working Group 3's just come out, is basically saying we're firmly on track towards an unlivable world. And that unlivable world is the world that youth are inheriting, that future generations are inheriting. So the very stark messages that are coming out of that report, we've lost the opportunity to address these. And if we are going to address it, we're going to have to act very, very quickly. UNICEF brought out a report last year saying the climate crisis is a child's rights crisis. And just in a headline statement from that report or summary, it says 1 billion children, that's half of the globe's children, are at extremely high risk of the impacts of the climate crisis. That's the highest category that they have. That means half of the world's children are basically have no ability to survive these extreme events which are coming their way. And then a study that was done last year, that the understanding about this climate crisis is really leading to young people's emotional trauma and climate anxiety. If we look in that graph there, this was over 10,000 young people who were interviewed in this study. About 85% are at least moderately worried, if not very or extremely worried. And the report says that climate change is causing distress, anger, and other negative emotions in youth worldwide. These are people who should be enjoying school, having recreational opportunities, growing up, understanding who they are. They should not be having to deal with this type of trauma. And that mental distress is negatively affecting their daily lives. This is almost like children who are born into a war situation, and that's a very pertinent topic at the moment with the war in Ukraine. And intergenerational inequities, another paper that came out just late last year, it says that the fact that younger generations will inevitably face the worst impacts of climate change, despite having contributed the least, is a cornerstone of the climate justice challenge, which Lisa mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. Today's youth will live in conditions which older generations have never experienced. And I think that's one of the issues that we're dealing with is that older generations don't see that this is such an issue because it's not something that they've experienced. And ultimately, the study says that the scientifically underpins the motivation for the protests by youth and for youth activism. And I can't emphasize that more, is that this abandonment by today's adult generations of youth and next generations means that there's a huge onus on youth to take responsibility now for your own future. And I just want to make the point here that the climate crisis is not unsolvable. Okay, we still have time to do it. And Working Group 3 report that just came out on mitigation says, made it abundantly clear the technologies and policies necessary to adequately address the climate crisis exist. And the only real obstacles are politics and fossil fuel interest. And I think the key point about that is that this is not a technological problem. It's a purely social and economic problem. And so the only way to solve it is through social activism. So then I'll just unpack some of that because I think often we deal with these sort of fairly dry climate science numbers. And this was done for the report case, as Crystal mentioned. The report is available. And it was to try and say, what does this actually mean for children today, children on the ground, children to be born in the future? So we tried to interpret the science in a way that would be much more understandable in people's daily lives. And we looked at those key issues on, for example, fresh water, food security, fire and fire risks, what extreme weather events would do to infrastructure, and particularly around service delivery of energy and transport and health and education, what it meant for forced migrations, and then the emotional well-being of children and future generations. And I'll just unpack each of those a little bit. I'm not going to go into as much detail as on the slides because the report is available. Just to show that, and in certain parts of the world, obviously the impacts are very different. In Southern Africa, which is a semi-arid region, you'll see there on the map here, these regions in red, like the Mediterranean, California, parts of South America, where you're already dry, when it gets hotter and drier, water becomes a huge issue. And this United Nations report back in 2008 said there may not be enough water for everyone to live on in the region. And that means there's going to be huge social upheaval and violence. So freshwater availability and quantity, the climate science is telling us that in those areas, as I mentioned, climate change will exacerbate these limitations on access to water, both quality and quantity. But of course, with more extreme weather events, we'll also get floods more often. This will damage infrastructure such as sanitation works, so precipitating disease outbreaks. And in South Africa today, diarrhea from poor quality water is already the biggest killer of under 5-year-olds. And that's going to be exacerbated. In less developed countries, very often girls and women are tasked with fetching water for their families. And they'll be spending much more time actually doing that. And that means girls will miss schooling. There's issues of insecurity when doing it and risks of violence. And so a lot of the gender equity gains, which we've seen over the last few decades, are going to be set back by these impacts. And things like food preparation, general hygiene and sanitation, where there's a lack of water, become much more difficult, affecting health, ability to attend school, and so on. And of course, lack of water leads to compromised food security, particularly for subsistence farmers, people who grow their own food. If there are prolonged droughts, the food crops fail. If it's so hot that you can't actually work out in the fields, you can't actually grow your crops. Floods, extreme events, heat stress will decrease productivity of those crops. And with warming, we're going to see pest and disease outbreaks on food crops. And so food insecurity will rise. And of course, children most often suffer from hunger and malnutrition. And having to spend longer hours assisting with food production and food procurement, again, most especially girls will be losing out on educational and other opportunities. And those will set them back right through the remainder of their lives. And ultimately, with these rising temperatures in semi-arid regions, many parts of South Africa and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa will become uninhabitable, which will lead to forced migrations. And I'll pick up on that in a minute. In dry, hot regions, of course, fire risk increases. I mentioned in Australia, which is also an arid region. And of course, higher temperatures and bigger wind speeds mean that these fires become much more damaging. In lots of the less developed world, including South Africa, there are huge informal settlements, which are particularly vulnerable to increasing fire risk. We see them, fires break out there a lot. And it's very difficult to control those fires when there isn't street access or fire stations and that sort of thing. And of course, children are incredibly vulnerable in these very disruptive events. When their homes are lost and burnt, their possessions are lost, their whole lives are disrupted. And of course, there's often friends, relatives, and often themselves who die in these instances. And so living with this daily anxiety of such events, especially for children, is incredibly traumatic. These extreme events, of course, will damage infrastructure such as roads and health clinics, education, schools, power, loss of electricity services. And service delivery itself will almost certainly decline because it's not possible for governments in poorer countries to actually keep rebuilding these services and to deal with these events as they become more frequent and more extreme. And so lack of services combined with food insecurity, lack of access to water and so on, will again be a contributing factor to forced migrations. So forced migrations around the world, involuntary migrations are the highest number ever recorded. And as people's livelihoods collapse, particularly in more rural areas where there isn't service delivery, where it is subsistence farming, they will be forced to move and move to cities and into these very risk-prone informal settlements. And of course, rising levels of forced migration leads to social conflict and violence. In South Africa, in-migration of people coming from the north has tended to these xenophobic conflicts in the country where people have been killed. It leads to loss of spatial and cultural identities from where people have grown up, what they're familiar with in terms of the geographies and the cultures around them. And for children to lose everything that is familiar to them in a very young age without understanding why and what they can do about it is, of course, again, hugely traumatic.
Nicholas,
So
hi, this is Felisa speaking. You have about 2 minutes. I just want to let you know. Thank you.
About to wrap up. So this huge emotional trauma, which will be expressed by physical, social, economic, and cultural disruption. And that UNICEF Children's Risk Index shows that most countries in the developing world are extremely high risk. So overall, children in particular are going to be heavily traumatized when they find that the adults that they depend on around them aren't able to secure their future. So we unpacked it a little bit further, and I'll skip these very quickly to try and put it into context even more locally in 3 different provinces in South Africa, and in 3 sort of future generations, so 20 and 20-year time gaps. And then in these graphics, which are in the report, it shows how those impacts actually ramp up over time and get more and more severe in each of these 20-year periods, and as those temperatures go up, which is what we're on track for, given the political inaction we're seeing. So that's for each of the 3 areas. And just to touch briefly, we're seeing this event right now playing out in KwaZulu-Natal province in South Africa, where we've had this unprecedented flooding, 4 months of summer rain in 24 hours. We have over 500 people dead, including 60 children, billions of dollars of worth of infrastructure, so that the collapse of service delivery. And just from an educational perspective, over 600 schools affected, 124 have suffered extreme damage, and more than 100 have cut off and they are inaccessible. So children can't even go to school, even if they're not damaged. And more than 40,000 people have been displaced, lost from their homes, moved from their homes, and so on. So this is very real. It's happening in many, many places around the world right now. And it's not just something for the future. So of course, youth activism, absolutely critical. I don't need to point out Greta to anybody, but I think the important point here is this point that she's always said, is that if solutions within the system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. And there's absolutely no rational reason for today's youth to accept this current system that is denying them a viable future. And so mass social mobilization and activism by youth who are being denied by today's adult generations is absolutely critical. You shouldn't have to be doing it, but you're going to have to do it. So just to wrap up, in conclusion then, every additional greenhouse gas emission will exacerbate global heating and the resultant climate impacts on today's youth and future generations. Unless we mitigate, which is still possible, future generations are going to be profoundly negatively impacted. There are going to be increasingly severe impacts by climate change. Their daily lives will be vastly more difficult. Many will suffer premature death, and their economic opportunities and opportunities for advancement will be severely curtailed. And of course, children will suffer the greatest harms, those being born into the climate crisis, where from the very day that they're born, they're going to be suffering from these events and the trauma that goes around it. And just to say that it is still possible to solve the climate crisis, but mass civil society mobilization is needed to drive that necessary change. Nothing else is working at this point in time. And just to say, what we've learned in the last 2 years is that overnight transformational change is absolutely possible if we have the political will to do it. So civil society, we have to get out there and we have to do it. Thanks very much for listening to that.
Thank you so much, Professor King, for the insightful presentation. It is so timely and significant to draw public attention to the climate crisis happening around the world. And I really like the idea of intergenerational inequity that highlights the environmental impact on youth and future generations. I just sent a link in the chat box. It is Professor King's report we have shared in the HREA's online resource center. You're welcome to check it out. And before the next presentation, I would like to also take the chance to remind everyone we'll have a Q&A session later after the presentation. If you want to hear more from the guest speakers, please leave your questions and comments on the Jamboard through the link in the chat box. Now let's give our warm welcome to the youth leader and climate activist, Amina Castronovo. She will bring in a youth perspective on climate activism. Amina, feel free to take the mic. It's your time.
Thank you, Crystal. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. And thank you to Professor King for sharing all the insight and the research he's done. Yeah, so today, could everyone see my screen and the slides? Yes, amazing. So today I'm going to bring in the perspective from youth activism and what it means to be an activist in my generation and really across generations. I see that there are probably mostly adults here, which is good. This is like a chance for teachers or leaders or mentors to reflect on how they can create a strong support system for the youth in their life and kind of question the different leadership roles and activist personas, which I'll get into later, that everyone can apply to their own lives. So I started my activist career or getting into environmental justice activism the summer after my freshman year. And now I'm a senior in high school. So I've had a few years. I've met a lot of different people in New York City, internationally. And I've gotten to learn a lot about what does it mean to think about the climate crisis in the context of like environmental justice. And environmental justice really talks about seeing the climate crisis as a part of a system of different social injustices and understanding that it's not just isolated, and that in order to address the climate crisis, you have to work with and be a part of different social justice movements that intersect with the climate crisis. And so that's kind of the first thing to always keep in mind when addressing this issue. So first, I kind of want to talk about what it means to be an activist in general, because I think a lot of times when we think of activists, we think of someone we see in the media or someone who's really outspoken. And I think that kind of holds some people back from really engaging and feeling passionate about issues. But if you're here right now, you're passionate in general, you realize this is something that needs to be changed and you want to be part of that change, that definitely means you're an activist. And I want to talk more about what it actually means to be an activist and those characteristics. So feel free if you want to put in the chat anything that comes to your mind when you think of activism, but I'm going to go more into like a few characteristics that come to my mind. A lot of activists for me are kind of everyday people at my school and other schools, people I see at protests or online or just in meetings with me, who are really there in terms of self-reflection. So a lot of activism, especially if you come from a privileged background, is reflecting on the different systems that you're part of and how are you upholding those systems and what do you need to do to kind of change that. And that means education, such as like being here. That means sitting back and like listening to people who are in the frontline communities who are experiencing this and understanding that this is going to be a lifelong reflection. It doesn't just happen once, like I am still learning, I will always be learning. I think of myself as an activist because I'm always reflecting and doing that work as much as I know how to. It is people who protest, if that's your form of activism. I'm in charge of helping to organize the New York City branch of the International Climate Strike. Those happen twice a year, but we also have a weekly protest as well. And I've also helped to organize and speak at different rallies that happen for Earth Day or just throughout the year. So that is also a characteristic. These are people who share their stories, and I'm going to go into this later, but I really think that storytelling is such an essential part, especially of youth activism. Because we are drawn into this movement because it is so personal and everyone has a connection to it. So figuring out what it means to have a climate story and your personal connection is going to be really, really important to being part of this movement. Again, as I mentioned before, like knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to educate yourself, when to be the one who's like sharing your story and when to think like, I need to reflect right now on my own prejudices or my own exposure to the world. Educating yourself as you are here. And then recognizing your strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to talk a bit about what an activist persona kind of means. But I really think a strong activist community is one where you recognize everyone's strengths and weaknesses and you work together to kind of do that, but not in a way that there's like a power hierarchy, which is something I think is really unique to a youth movement is that we're more focused on how can we all work together equally rather than having, you know, an organizational power hierarchy where we have to go to different point people to like address certain things. Like we all work together to make decisions, whether that's through like supporting a piece of legislation or organizing a protest. And I think that honestly makes the space a lot stronger and supportive and working more towards the society that we want to be a part of. And of course, activists are passionate about what they're here for. And if you're here, I'm sure you're very passionate. So thank you for being here. So I quickly want to go into different activist personas and what that means. And I think that everyone exhibits all four of these characteristics, and there are more. But I think it's helpful to think about like how you would categorize yourself almost so that you understand like what you can contribute to this movement. So the first is a helper persona, and those are ones who come to aid in those in need, provide services. I would say like a lot of teachers or like mentors, especially with youth, kind of exhibit this helper persona, giving a training, which is like what I'm doing now. I'm like exhibiting my helper persona. The next is a rebel. And so these are the people who you'll probably see like on the front lines in the media. They love to public speak, they love to hold up signs, and they're kind of not afraid to like talk back at authority or existing power structures. And I think this kind of like comes in waves depending on what you're comfortable with, and I think changes throughout your activist experience. The third is an advocate. And this is similar to a rebel, but it's more focused on kind of communicating through, communicating through with different power structures. Sorry, 1 second, my computer is.
We can see your slide. We stopped sharing it.
Sorry, my computer, okay. Sorry, 1 second.
No problem. Crystal, can you share this slide or you've got it back?
No, I got it. Yeah, sorry, my computer was not working for a second. So an advocate is someone who is talking with the existing power structures. So I'll talk more about later different actions, but a popular action, especially in youth spaces, is lobbying, which is talking and trying to get support for different pieces of legislation. So an advocate is someone who's really passionate about that and who understands how to organize that. And the final one is an organizer, and this is someone who's usually helping to organize this. So like Crystal, she was organizing this webinar, she was exhibiting her organizer persona, and really working on like building relationships across like intersections of like social justice movements, which I mentioned before, and like building those relationships and getting into it. Yeah, so feel free to say in the chat which one you think you are, if you're a few of them, and which ones really resonate with you. And I encourage you that if you're in any youth spaces to kind of bring up these definitions with them, because that might kind of help them to get more personalized within the movement. So next I'm going to talk about storytelling. Storytelling really humanizes our issues and molds our perspectives. You can throw out all the data and all the scary facts in the world, but if you don't humanize it with a story, people are going to be afraid, they're not going to know what to do. But once you give people ownership of their own stories by giving them that space to recognize how they relate to this movement and different movements, that's when they're going to start to become really passionate in this movement. So that includes vulnerability, that includes recognizing the audience. So how you're going to share your story in a group like this versus with a senator versus at a rally is going to be different. But I think overall the vulnerability aspect and the humanizing aspect remains the same. A big part of your story is like mobilizing it. So that could be sharing it here, that could be writing an article or a letter to the editor, or just like speaking about it at your school or in any other public spaces is really important. And then I always really encourage people to connect their storytelling to influence policy, so that once you've grabbed people's attention, you can give them an action. And a lot of youth activism centers around different actions that other youth can take really quickly. So that could be writing or calling their representative's office or meeting with them. That could be trying to bring this education into their school spaces or other community spaces. And then lastly, storytelling is a living catalyst. So people will be impacted by this. It'll influence people for years to come. It's really very, very important. So I encourage you to reflect on your climate story. Some small steps that are usually taken in activist movements, social media campaign. I'm sure you all know that our generation is very into social media. I personally am not a fan, but I do think it is effective to spread education as long as that education is like thoroughly researched. There are sources. I mean, I think it still can get a little murky because of just different researching styles. But in terms of like talking to people and giving them actions, I thought has been helpful. You'll probably have seen that through like Earth Day and Earth Week and like the strike week of different actions people can take if they're not available to go in person. So it has been helpful during COVID. Another is a protest or rally. It's actually very easy to organize one with your school as long as you're working with your administration. There are also a lot of students I know who do not have administration who are in support of their activism and they have just like walked out in general. That is something we're not afraid to do. So I encourage you to support your students if that's the situation that they're in. And the last smaller action is calling or writing to your representative. This is also very popular in the activist movement. Like I said before, it's very easy to like find your representatives online and then call them, write to them. One time I worked with a middle school green team and they all wrote letters of support of a certain piece of legislation they wanted passed. And then I sent them to the office who was co-sponsoring that piece of legislation, and legally they have to look at it and file it. And so that was a really beautiful moment to see that those middle schoolers got to write about their personal experience and it was part of the legislative process. Some long-term projects that are also very popular is writing op-eds, letters to the editor, article writing. This is one of the first things I did when I was part of the activist movement. I went to one of the climate strikes before COVID and I wrote about it. I wrote about why it's really important that youth have a voice at this march and why it makes a difference. You can self-publish, you can contact your local news sources. That's what I did. Or you could also write a letter to the editor, which is like in response to an article. One time I wrote in response to an article kind of praising this politician for all the climate work they've done. And I was like, we all know they actually haven't been doing all this great climate work. So that's another way to exhibit your activist persona. The second is lobbying. This is all about scheduling a meeting, researching. This is also great for students who maybe aren't as comfortable talking to representatives yet because there are different roles that they can take on. They can be a note taker. They can just be there to kind of like thank the representative, and then hopefully later on they'll feel more comfortable talking to the representative. But a lot of this is about holding the representative accountable, asking them to sign on to a piece of legislation, and then kind of following up with them via email. And a big thing that I really stress for youth is that you do not have to know everything to lobby for a bill. You are youth, you're not a researcher yet. If you want to be, this is all about you showing up for the other youth, sharing your story and showing the representatives why you care about this bill. And if you don't know something, follow up with them and show that you are serious about keeping in communication and like being held accountable for your own actions, that you expect the same from your fellow youth. So lastly, I want to talk about what my Environmental Justice Club has done at my school for any ideas. A big thing that we've done this year is organize workshops with our school. So the most recent international climate strike was March 25th. And the morning before the strike, we worked with our administration to organize 2 workshops that were mostly student-led. There were some teacher and parent-led workshops as well, but everyone in our school were able to register for the workshop they wanted to go to. And these workshops were not just climate crisis focused. It was also in relation to Black History Month and Women's History Month. And we got student leaders from across the school to come together and lead these different workshops that connected to the climate crisis, but also these different intersectional issues that we deal with at my school in New York City and internationally. And this also happened when I was a freshman. And I feel like this was really a time where I looked to see like, wow, there are people just a few years older than me who are leading these workshops, taking up space, and really just being an inspirational for me and a mentor to me. And I feel like creating those mentor-mentee relationships between students is really, really important in this movement. So I definitely suggest supporting that, looking into that if you do work with youth. Our club also works on curriculum. Last year, we spoke with the different departments, history, science, and English department. My school is really special because we do not take any state regents. So teachers, senior teachers get to choose which classes they teach. So we lobbied with them. We gave them resources. We said we want classes that have to do with environmental justice. So now we have a climate crisis history and science class, and we were supposed to have a nature class, but hopefully we'll have it next year for English. We also worked on lobbying this year. We worked on a clothing drive. We had everyone bring in old clothes, and then we had a little like drive where people could come and like swap clothes at school. That was really fun. And then for all of the science buffs out there, we have an air quality project where we have air quality sensors, and we go across the city and we map it out, the different air quality around the city. And then we're going to write it all up, map it all out, and hopefully send it to our mayor, Eric Adams, and tell him that he needs to get his act together and do more for the climate crisis, because he's definitely not. So yeah, that's a bit about what we've been doing. As Crystal mentioned before, I'm also a mentor for middle school, elementary school, and some high school green teams. So I really enjoy going to their classes and like talking to them and bringing out the climate stories, talking about activist personas, and then coming back and seeing all the amazing work that they've done at their school. So thank you so much for coming. This is my email. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And thank you again, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much, Amina, for sharing your amazing work at school and beyond campus. I really appreciate learning how to become a climate justice activist, and we're so glad to see this kind of a variety of actions young people are taking to deal with the environmental challenges today. So now in the following 15 minutes, let's go to the Jamboard to have a Q&A session. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the Jamboard? Thank you. We can see that there are already a few questions posted. Thank you everyone for participating. And you can still continue posting your questions by adding sticky notes like this. Now I would like to invite Professor King and Amina to pick questions from the board and give your responses or comments. Either of you would like to go first, please feel free to take the mic.
Well, maybe I can give Amina a break because she's just been speaking for the last 15 minutes. I'll just take a stab at the first one. What is the one thing you want youth to know about climate change? I think the key point to there is it is solvable, but it requires civil society action. You know, many people say, oh, it's too late and it's hopeless and we can't do anything, but we can effect the changes. And that's really the critical message, I think. And just as Amina was talking about, there's so many activities that people can get involved in. And just taking part in activities is a very motivating and stimulating thing to do. So really, it is solvable, along with so many of the other environmental crises, but it requires a change in the system.
Yeah, I can address the one that's where, to me, Amina, did you have experience meeting representatives to lobby? I did. They were pretty much all frustrating, unfortunately. I've conducted them in person before COVID and then virtually during COVID. A lot of times the work is coming after, because most representatives will say, yes, I support this. And then you have to make sure they actually sign on to the bill, which takes a while. So I'd say a lot of the work comes with like even taking a picture with them and posting on social media and saying, blank agreed to like support this bill. So now everyone knows and you kind of have to do it, and then providing them with those resources afterwards. There, of course, have been representatives who have said no. There have been people who are just more concerned with, oh, it's the youth who are coming, it's like lobby, this is so cool, like I want to be in support, but then not actually hearing us because they think that we don't actually know what we're talking about. Last year, I worked a lot on a climate education bill. I worked closely with the senator's office. That was also a little frustrating because we were a youth organization. We were very serious about getting this bill passed. And it was just very difficult to be in communication with the office. I don't know if that was because we were youth or another reason. It might have been because of COVID. That was like during the height of the pandemic as well. And then in a few weeks, I am going to Albany to lobby for some other bills. I also went to Albany before the pandemic. That was really cool. You get to actually go into the senators and assembly people's office and like lobby with them. I definitely suggest that experience if that is possible for you. But again, I would say that the actual work comes after. It's not.
Okay, I'm happy to take a stab. First of all, at this one on the bottom left, about poorer countries have hardly contributed to global warming and have sometimes abundant and cheap fossil fuel resources. I want to understand they want to keep them, use them to keep expenditure low. I think the important point about that is that fossil fuels don't come cheap. They only seem to come cheap because of the externalities of not factoring in first of all, the exploration for them, then the extraction of them, then the transportation of them to where they're going to be burned, so the coal-fired power station, and then the transmission of the electricity from that coal-fired power station to where it's going to be utilized. All of that requires massive infrastructure. It's way, way more expensive than any of the renewable energy sources that we currently have at our disposal. Fossil fuels are a very old and tired technology now. It's getting more and more difficult to find coal and oil and so on. Whereas renewable energy is very new technology and the costs are coming down dramatically. So the argument about costs is really dead in the water these days. And of course, if you don't use your fossil fuels, you also get away from things like air pollution, water pollution, health problems, and all the other attendant issues that go with it. So there's a huge amount of information at various websites such as Climate Center, Skeptical Science, the IPCC reports that give you all that information. So I would really encourage people to look that up. And then on the bottom right, there's a question that says, how do you work with many other organizations, NASA policymakers collectively to solve problems? I think one of the key issues is to try and find individuals in those organizations who you know are going to be empathetic, and particularly if they have a science background, because the science really is unequivocal in terms of what it's telling us. So it's really, it's about person-to-person interaction very often. Unfortunately, many of these debates tend to get acrimonious because they're not based on the science and based on the politics. And so we have to try and subvert that by trying to get common agreement on a common objective. And the common objective, surely for everybody, is to have a better future for today's youth and future generations. And I think if you can try and talk about, what type of legacy we're going to be leaving this administration, the next administration, it's finding that common ground, which is the critical way to get people to work on solving or finding common solutions rather than having it become confrontational.
I'm happy to address the one in the middle about older activists. I believe when you mean older, if you mean adults rather than, for example, my age, like I consider myself older than like middle school activists. I would say understand that you understand the climate anxiety, but you might not understand the perspective that youth are coming from. And a lot of times I've noticed that teachers or like adult mentors will still try and mold youth into the idea of a good activist. And that is someone who is still willing to like work within existing power structures. They might focus more on like sustainability rather than the social justice aspect of the environmental justice movement. And that's not what youth are trying to do now. At least most of the youth who have like really put in the education and the time for this. And I do believe that with time and like more exposure, everyone is more focusing on what are like the existing power structures that actually do not work for us and we're tired of upholding and like kind of communicating through. And so I really encourage older activists to take a step back and let younger activists figure out what they want to do, the steps they want to take, the projects they want to work on, and then just be there in support. rather than kind of telling them what to do or like how you would suggest something happening, especially for like younger students who maybe don't have any experience. It's going to take them a while to find their place, but they can't do that if there's a teacher there kind of telling them what project they're going to do in school. And honestly, I've found a lot of really impressive projects and leadership roles taken when students were just given the time to find themselves in the movement. So that's what I would suggest. And also, just as a side note, there might be some activist spaces where adults just are not welcomed because of the reputation or because of just how the organization is trying to work. Like, for example, Fridays for Future, we have weekly meetings. Sometimes adults are welcome, sometimes not, just because adults tend to take up a lot of space that does not encompass the same perspectives that we are trying to achieve. But we still welcome adults sometimes. There have been a lot of adults who have helped us organize really well, so very appreciative of that. But just be aware of that and welcoming of any space that exists. And then I can also just address the one on the bottom: what is the role in policymakers in promoting a blue-green economy? There's so many. This could relate to like fossil fuel sustainability. I personally really believe in the power of education. This means like teacher training, giving resources to all schools. If you're aware of like the New York City school system, it's very segregated. The application process, admissions, it's very inequitable. It's racist. It's so many different things that need to be worked on. And I feel like getting to at that system, especially in New York City, is really important, because I've seen the power of like what it means when students are educated, are aware of each other and each other's stories and the impact of the climate crisis, and then also given like civic education, like what are your rights? And this changes across state, across city, across country, across the world, and like what are the different steps you can take within your schools to accomplish that? And I really wish that policymakers focused on that educational aspect and the curriculum part of environmental justice.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor King and Amina, for your brilliant answers. And thank you everyone for participating in this wonderful Q&A session. So now I will go back to the slide. Give me a second. Sorry. So can you see the slide? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Let's together visit HREA's online resource center on this slide to see what HREA can offer to support your work on climate justice and environmental rights. If you go to HREA's official website, hrea.org, you will find a resource center tab on the menu bar, like shown on the slide. Under the tab, you can click on Search Resource Center, which will lead you to the two options, either by human rights theme or by target group and HRE strategy. Searching by theme, you can find a collection of HRE resources on topics at the intersection of human rights and environmental education that we prepared for International Earth Day. We have assembled 34 resources that specifically address the right to environment, including Professor King's report and the toolkit Amina shared with us. You can also explore other related keywords, such as right to health, right to life, right to food and water, etc. If you have your own HRE resources to share with the wider community, please feel free also to make a submission via this portal on HREA's website. That's all for the presentation on human rights education resources on our website. Now I would like to pass the mic to Dr. Tibbetts to conclude the webinar.
Thank you, Crystal. And a warm thanks to our speakers. I hope, Amina and Dr. King, you're seeing all the gratitude in the chat box that's being expressed, and how fantastic that each of you have resources also that you've shared with us at HREA. That's on our online resource center for listeners that have, viewers that have participated in the webinar today or in the future. They can follow up and learn more about your work. So how perfect, just so perfect. So I'm still on the edge of my seat with all that's been discussed, and it's really hard to conclude actually, but we will be doing that so that we can respect everyone's time and wrap up in the next 1-2 minutes. A couple of things I want to mention. If you did sign up for this webinar, we'll be putting you into the HREA listserv. So if you already weren't a member of the listserv, you will be subscribed automatically. You have the option, obviously, to unsubscribe, but I did want to give you a heads up. We'll be doing that. We do have other events that we are sponsoring. We have other resources related to human rights education writ large that you'd be finding out about. So, but I did want to give you a heads up on that. We would like to invite your feedback on this webinar itself. So the same link that you used to post questions in the Jamboard, if you go back to that link and you go to the second page, there's at the top of the Jamboard, there's a little arrow. You can go to page 2, and that's where you're most welcome to leave your feedback for our webinar today and anything else you might want to say to the speakers that you didn't put in the chat box already. The last thing I want to mention also is that we are personally, as at the beginning I said this as well, at HREA, and so many of us who are adults and who are long-term activists are so respectful and of the work that's being done by youth activists like Amina. And I'm sure all of you who are here in this webinar like me are just so wowed by the work she does. And thank you so much, Amina, for taking time out of your day, your school day in particular, to be with us today. So we who are adults involved in activism, we do have a role to be allies with the youth activists, as Amina said, and to also to support, but to give them that full space to make decisions for themselves as best they know. In keeping with that spirit, HREA is going to be sponsoring a youth gathering in late July, which we will be announcing on our listserv, which Amina is helping us to think about. And it's going to be a space that we're going to bring, we're going to invite youth to come to learn more about human rights and how that might be related to their own work in activists, whatever identity issue or whatever issue they're engaged in. As Amina said, climate justice is an intersectional issue, as so many human rights challenges are. So we're going to invite you to come in to share with one another, to peer train. People like Amina have so much to share, and we'll be letting you know more about that on the HREA listserv in the future. So a warm thanks to our speakers again. Thank you, listeners, viewers, for coming and taking the time out of your day to be with us. Many thanks also for Crystal for organizing so well. Wishing everyone a terrific day, and let's find our place in the climate justice movement. If we already haven't found one, let's find one as soon as possible. Thank you all.